Episode 4. Paul examined. Authority, law, and the first commandment. In the name of God, the one God of Abraham. In the previous episodes, we examined what Jesus taught, what he promised would come after him, and the standard he himself gave. To test what is true, today we turn to a figure who shaped Christianity more than any other, after Jesus himself, Paul, not to attack him, not to dismiss him, but to examine his teaching fairly by the standard Jesus himself set. This examination is not based on later theology, external scripture, or religious identity. Paul is not judged against Islam, nor against modern belief. He is judged only against Jesus' own words, recorded in the Gospels. Part 1. Who was Paul? Paul did not walk with Jesus during Jesus' earthly ministry. He was not one of the 12. The book of Acts tells us that Paul's encounter with Jesus occurs after the crucifixion and the ascension. Paul describes himself as a former Pharisee, a Roman citizen, and a missionary operating within Greco-Roman cities. According to Acts chapter 18, Paul worked as a tent maker, a skilled trade within the Roman world. Paul does not claim authority because he knew Jesus personally. During his ministry, his authority rests on a vision he reports after Jesus' departure, and on his own theological reasoning. That does not disqualify Paul, but it does require scrutiny. Part 2, Jesus' standard for what comes after him. Jesus did not leave his followers without a test. He said that true guidance after him would meet specific criteria. Jesus said the one who comes after him would not speak from himself, would speak only what he hears, would glorify Jesus, and would not abolish God's law. This is not a later doctrine. This is Jesus' own framework. So the question is simple. Does Paul meet that standard? Part 3. Paul's own admissions in context. Paul's letters address real communities, facing real questions. In his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 7, Paul responds to issues of marriage, divorce, and mixed faith households, situations Jesus did not address directly. Paul is transparent about this. He says, "To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord." Later he says, "I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment." And he concludes, "In my judgment. And I think that I, too, have the Spirit of God." Paul is not hiding this. He clearly distinguishes between what Jesus taught and what Paul reasons himself. That honesty matters, but it also creates responsibility, because Jesus said that what comes after him would not speak from itself. Paul explicitly distinguishes between Jesus' commands and his own judgments. That means Paul's conclusions must be tested, not assumed. Part 4, Paul and the law, what he actually teaches. To be fair to Paul, we must begin where Paul begins. Paul says the law is holy, righteous, and good. He does not call it evil, but he does redefine its role. Paul teaches that people are justified by faith. Apart from works of the law, believers are no longer under the law, and a law functioned as a temporary guardian until Christ came. Paul affirms the law's goodness, yet teaches that its binding authority over believers has ended. This is decisive. Paul places the law in a non-binding role for those who believe. Part 5, Jesus and the law side by side. Now place this next to Jesus' own words. Jesus says, "He did not come to abolish the law. Not even the smallest part would pass away, and those who relax even the least command would be called least in the kingdom." Jesus presents the law as enduring, would be called gained binding, Paul presents the law as holy but temporary and no longer binding. This is not a matter of tone, it is a matter of direction. Jesus affirms continuity. Paul introduces discontinuity. Both cannot be teaching the same thing in the same sense. Part 6. Paul and the language he uses about Jesus. Jesus speaks consistently as God's servant, messenger, and Messiah. He directs worship to God. He prays to God. He identifies God as the only true God and himself as the one sent. Paul, however, uses theological language about Jesus that Jesus does not use of himself. In the Gospel record, Paul describes Jesus as pre-existent, involved in creation, central to salvation, and the object of faith, in place of law-based obedience. This is not quotation, it is interpretation. Part 7, the first commandment test. At this point, the issue can be stated simply. Jesus affirmed the first commandment, the Lord our God. The Lord is one. That commandment does not allow shared objects of devotion, redirected worship, or frameworks that absorb divine functions into another figure. Jesus never asks to be worshipped. He never redirects devotion to himself. He calls people back to God. Paul affirms one God, yet restructures devotion, salvation, and obedience in ways Jesus himself never articulates. This creates a tension, not with identity, but with the first commandment, Jesus called the greatest. Final judgment by Jesus' own standard, so we answer plainly, would Jesus recognize Paul's theology as a continuation of his own teaching by Jesus' own test? Paul sometimes speaks from judgment. Paul redefines the law Jesus affirmed. Paul uses language about Jesus that Jesus does not use of himself. And Paul introduces a framework that reshapes devotion and obedience. This is not a judgment of Paul's sincerity. It is a refusal to elevate interpretation above the one who set the standard. Jesus would not recognize Paul's theology as identical to his own message. Closing. Jesus did not come to redirect worship. He came to restore it to God alone, and that remains the dividing line. In the next episode, we will examine how Paul's interpretation became dominant through empire, councils, and political power, often overruling voices closer to Jesus himself. Truth before tribe. Two brothers, one mission, one God.